folks, and welcome to the screencast where we study the evidences to support evolution. One of the first areas that we're going to look at are fossils. Then we'll take a look at anatomical similarities between organisms and species. We'll look at embryonic similarities between species. The similarities in macromolecules. Macro means large. And so the macromolecules of living things are things like DNA and proteins. We'll do a neat lab activity in class to really investigate what that means. We'll try to wrap our brains around this concept of biogeography. First off, fossils are studied by paleontologists. That's a branch of science that studies fossils and tries to make sense of them. A fossil is a trace or a remnant of a once living thing. Fossils are typically found in sedimentary rock. That's rock that's created by sediment, of course, sand, mud, or clay that has become solid. And to determine the age of a fossil, we typically follow this idea of the law of superposition, which states that each successive layer of rock was deposited on top of one another over time. So the deeper the stratum means layer, the older the rock, and therefore any fossils found in it are older than any fossils found on top of that. So looking at this diagram here behind me, it's oversimplified, but typically you see at the bottom in the oldest rocks are some fossils that are drawn in by the artist, but as you move up, the fossils take on a little bit more complexity, and certainly the older ones are deeper than the younger ones on top. And life gets more complex as time goes on. The abundance of fossils found between organisms that seem closely related allow paleontologists to put together these diverse family trees of particular organisms. In this case, the modern day horse, which you see up here, the North American horse, Equus is the genus, can be traced back over 55 million years to a number of fossil finds, to a very small organism found in South America, no longer alive today. Subtle similarities in bone and skull features allowed scientists to put these fossils together and come up with the idea that they were related. Another area of study are anatomical similarities. Homologous structures are similar features, that is, their structures are similar, but they have different functions. They're thought to have originated from shared or common ancestors. This plays nicely into Charles Darwin's idea of descent with modification, that present organisms are descended from common ancestors with modifications in their structures. And Charles Darwin would have said that they were caused by natural selection. This diagram is great. In the center you see a particular formula for forelimbs of these organisms that are all around. Up at the top you see a single bone. In your arm that would be your humerus. Below that would be two bones. In you that's the radius and the ulna. Several smaller bones called the carpals, the wrist bones. You've got metacarpals and then phalanges. As we look at the different organisms, the bat, the monkey, the dolphin, the anteater, the mole, the horse, and the pig all have that single bone that you have as a humerus. In fact, that's what the bone is called in those organisms. They also have the two-bone formula for the forearm, the similar carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So the forelimb in all of these organisms, having similar structure but different function, would be considered homologous structures. Here it is again in a little bit clearer picture, showing organisms that are not all mammals like they were in the last picture. Here we're showing a reptile, the turtle, the dolphin, human, horse, and bat again, which are all mammals. But then the bird, which is an avian, they all have the same formula for the bone structure. Again, homologous structures, similar structure but different functions in each of the organisms. And this might suggest a common ancestor. The same pattern shows up again in the fossil record in some of the first land-dwelling organisms. In their lobed fin feature are these bony structures that show the same design. Other anatomical similarities involve vestigial structures. This is a structure these are structures that are useless today, but perhaps did serve some purpose over time. In the modern day whale, we see vestigial hip bones. We see vestigial hip bones and features on the vertebrae in the lower region, and features on the lower regions of the vertebrae that suggest that the ancestor of the modern day whale had hip bones and hind limbs. And this is consistent with the fossil record when we tie together those organisms which we think may have led to the modern day whale. Other features that you can find on yourself that are considered vestigial structures are things like the nictitating membrane. It's a fold of skin and connective tissue that's in the corner of your eye. These are found in some birds and other reptiles. Muscles attached to the ear, which have no function in humans, but in other organisms, allow it to move its ear to locate sound. You've got some caudal vertebrae known as your tailbone. We've got extra teeth that actually cause us some problem called the wisdom teeth. And an appendix, which has no function at all, but is thought to have been at some point in an ancestor an extension of our digestive system when we needed more digestion of our food. Let's look at similarities between embryos. You might know that an embryo is a developing organism. And we're going to pay particularly close attention to vertebrate embryos because that's where most of the similarities occur. After that is when many differences start to show up. What's interesting about embryonic similarities is that the development tends to mirror the evolutionary changes that scientists believe that organisms went through as they did evolve. And again, these similarities tend to point toward common ancestors. If you look at these pictures here, the fish being a fish and the salamander being its next closest relative of an amphibian, shows lots of similarities. But look at across the top, and these sketches of all of these embryos of vertebrate organisms tend to be very, very... Now, similarities in macromolecules. These are the big molecules of life. These are the large molecules of life, such as DNA, RNA, and proteins, as well as the amino acids, the building blocks of protein. It's generally understood that the fewer the differences between the macromolecules of organisms, the more closely related they might be. For example, the chimpanzee is shown to have about 93% similarity in its DNA than humans. So we consider them our closest evolutionary cousin. Now, the idea of biogeography is that organisms that tend to be close to one another and are similar tend to be more closely related evolutionarily, and their differences result from the fact that they have occupied different niches, and over time, generation after generation, have become more different. The prediction which is made possible by biogeography is this: if evolution were in fact the case, we should generally expect species that are closely related to be found near each other, unless there are good reasons for them not to be, such as great mobility. What is also true of biogeography is that organisms that are not closely related to each other but occupy similar ecological niches in similar environments can evolve to look more like each other, even though they are distantly related. For example, here the marsupial mammal mole, found in Australia, lives in a similar environment than the eutherian mammal mole in North America, yet they are distantly related. Some other examples of eutherian and marsupial mammal similarities. The marsupial mammals are all found in Australia. The eutherian mammals are found in Europe and North America. My favorite here in North America is the flying squirrel. In Australia you can find a similar squirrel called the sugar glider, different name, also very distantly related, but seems to have adapted the same way of getting around from tree to tree as the flying squirrel. Again, it occupied an ecological niche, and the environment allowed these organisms to be similar, even though their ancestors. We're going to do some more investigations back in class. If you've got any questions, certainly write them down now, and we'll answer them at the beginning of the next session. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you back in class.